Team name, yes, I am a Gryffindor fan for all you haters out there. Don't let the screen fool you. Today we're talking about Amazon Cognito security best practices. But to understand that, you need to understand what decentralized authentication in AWS Cloud is. If you are someone who probably just wants to get to the AWS security best practice, which is basically split into Amazon side as well as the client application side, I would leave a timeline at the bottom for you to go straight to the security best practice and you can just understand that. But if you are someone who probably don't know much about Amazon Cognito and want to understand what are some of the security foundational pieces you need to understand before you even start doing the path of simply securing your Amazon Cognito. So let's get into it. And if you haven't already watched the previous two videos of the Docker security best practice or what do you do on day one of starting in AWS, definitely check out the videos. I'll leave a link for that on the top as well. As always, all the resources that we have would be available on cloudsecuritybootcamp.com, where you would see every resources that have been used so far in the bootcamp, in the future bootcamps, and will continue to be used over here. But for now, let's get back to the other one. But yeah, you should be able to see all the resources over here. That's cloudsecuritybootcamp.com. The first place to start is credential. If you are a security person who's going to be talking about credentials and user directories, you probably want to understand the different kind of authentication out there. You would probably know one very obviously, which is rightmost, your traditional authentication, where you have username and password, and that's pretty much what you care about. And usually sometimes you may have a physical access card. Like if you're someone who works in a company where you're required to go into the office, where you might get a physical card to walk you through the door, that's also a traditional authentication system. You can look at that as well. That's physical. However, today, probably to understand Amazon Cognito, you need to understand the other three that are there on the screen as well, like single sign-on, OAuth, and OpenID. Now, from an authentication and authorization perspective, SAML, which is Security Assertion Markup Language, allows you to have a single point of entry into any application that you know. The best way, and that's why the logo of Face ID, not that Face ID using SAML, but Face ID on your iPhone or your Android, we use one credential to log in into anything you want. Basically, instead of passing on your credential to, say, your facebook.com or anywhere else, you're basically telling Facebook or Instagram or whatever app you have on your phone that, hey, why don't you use my Face ID? And let that be the username password moving forward, so I don't have to remember username password at all. Another way of doing this is using authentication methodology called OpenID Connect. Now, OpenID Connect allows you to use your social credentials like your Google credential, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, just put any social credential, even Amazon these days as well. If you have any social credential that you would like to use to authenticate and don't want to remember your username, password, or create a separate one every time you sign up for a new service, you can use something called OpenID Connect. Now, you don't have to specifically select OpenID Connect when you're trying to do this with your Twitter account or anywhere else, but you definitely have to understand that you can do it and your application would have to understand that and be able to do that. Now, that's just for authentication. It does not do authorization. For authorization, there's something called OAuth, specifically OAuth 2.0, which is an authorization service that is usually tag teamed together with the OpenID. And the idea behind using OpenID Connect and OAuth is that if you are using an application which is used by consumers, like pretty much every social media website out there would be classified as a consumer application that people like you and I would use regularly. We are not business people, not all of us, but some of us are just regular people who just want to use a Facebook app to keep up on friends or snoop around on what our friends are doing on a weekend. Either ways, we would require authentication. And sometimes, like I'm very active on LinkedIn. If you just search for Ashish Rajan or Cloud Security Podcast on LinkedIn, you'll probably find that our pages are quite active. Now, that's not my only social. I would also be on Twitter under Hashish Rajan, but I post quite regularly on LinkedIn. I don't want to just, copy paste every time the same thing into Twitter, and sometimes it's a whole text thing as well. But nowadays, these social media applications understand that you as a user may want to post the same information on other places as well. So when they ask you if you want to push out your LinkedIn post onto your Twitter account and you click on the authorize button, or if you're watching our Docker security best practice video where we used GitHub credentials to log in into Sneak, and I'll leave a link for that here as well if you want to go check out that video on how that happened. That workflow essentially is the OAuth and OpenID workflow. And there's an exchange of token that happens at the end of it, which allows a user like you and I to log in into our favorite application out there. Now, these are very quick explanation of all of these authentication, but I can definitely go a whole deep dive into each one of these and how they can be used. Probably another video. If you want me to make one of those, definitely leave a comment over there as well. Let's talk about decentralized authentication. Till now, I spoke about authentication, the different kinds of it, different kinds of authorization. Decentralized authentication is an extension of kind of the concept that was shared by OAuth and OpenID. The principle over there is simple. I only want to store my username password at one location, and I don't want to create username password every time I go to a new application I have to sign up. A lot of people are smart enough to not use the same password everywhere, or even more smarter, that they would use a password manager to store passwords for each user ID password that they create everywhere. Me personally, being a security person, I always feel that there's a level of trust you have to manage between different applications. So whatever your risk tolerance is, whatever your organization's risk tolerance would be, that would decide whether you choose to go down the path of using something like an OAuth, OpenID, to authorize another application so you can offload the fact that, hey, I don't want to deal with username password. So as an application, we would decide that, hey, you don't have to use our username password. You can use your existing Facebook ID or GitHub ID or LinkedIn ID to authenticate, and we would be more than happy to give you your user profile. Or you could decide that, hey, single sign-on is the only way, where again, I would only have a username password at one particular location. Probably a diagram would be a better way to explain this. So if you look at the diagram over there, I, as an ID, that's me, with my digital ID and my physical ID, if I wanted to share that across my government IDs or my social IDs, I can do that using OAuth or SAML or any other industry standard that is well known in the industry for authentication and authorization. That means I'm not storing my username and password anywhere else apart from that one location where I want it to be stored, and I'm just authorizing all these other applications to be able to access those services. That is the dream of decentralized authentication. But what you would find in many organizations that you might end up working with, authentication usually relies on one or two applications that are covered by OAuth or SAML or username authentication. Some applications don't even have username password, which is probably a bad idea, but based on your risk tolerance, you might decide to not have a username password at all. And that's a whole different story for another video. Another definition I want you to be across is Amazon Cognito. What is it? Amazon Cognito is your service which allows authentication with users that it stores locally in the Amazon account. The simplest way to explain this is you have an application, and if you want to have Ashish, Sandra, Sarah, think of any other name of your best friend or colleague, you basically want all of them to be able to log into this amazing application you're creating. You need to give them a username password. Where would you store the username password? That's what Cognito would provide. It is basically a user directory with the context of Amazon Web Service. What I mean by that is there are two types of Amazon Cognito. One is called the Cognito User Pool, and the other one is called the Cognito Identity Pool. If you look on the left-hand side, the user pool is what is doing your authentication using OAuth. You basically talk to social media sites, you get authorized, you can use GitHub, as I showed in my first video in this series. You can use that information to get authorization from the user that you can use their credential and get the trust relationship between the social media site as well as your new application as a way to offload the need for you to have a username password stored locally. Your Cognito could be that connection for you to extend, or you can even have users directly logging in and registering themselves to the Cognito pool themselves as well. Depending on how you choose to do it, this would only allow that user access to the application itself. But what about access to everything else in Amazon, like Amazon S3 bucket, Amazon Cognito, connection to DynamoDB, or anywhere else in AWS you want to use a service? This is where the identity pool comes in. Identity pool allows an application to request for temporary credentials. Basically, it acts like an access broker. It's basically saying, hey, you seem to already have credentials and you seem to know your Amazon credentials as well. So I'm going to give you a temporary credential so that you can access services within AWS using the temporary credential. Good luck. So that's what Amazon Cognito and its two types are. And depending on the application you're working with, you may choose to go down path of one or the other. But what you would find is most likely you would end up working with both of the pools in some scenarios where the application requires it. But you may also choose to have a custom backend where you don't use the identity pool. You might just use the credential of the backend to generate temporary credentials to access AWS. You can even use API Gateway if you wanted to let that be the broker in between, but there could be multiple ways to do this. Now, let's walk through Amazon Cognito and see what that pool is like, and let's go into the conversation. All right, so we're on the Amazon console now, and I've logged in. Now I'm just going to search for Cognito. There it is. All right, you're right there, and they have redesigned the console. By the way, this is something interesting call out. Just because you learn a service in AWS does not mean that the service would always be the same. So at the moment, as you can see, this notice that they have redesigned the user pool. So let's start with the business case we spoke about. You know how we mentioned two things. Either you can add users to your app or you can grant access to AWS services. The same idea where what kind of user pool are you trying to create? Are you trying to create an identity pool, which will require you to grant access to AWS service, or you can use the add user directly to your app. So I'm just going to use the app one because that's what's more relevant for this bootcamp. I go into it. Now it's already pre-selected the Cognito user pool for me. But I can also say, hey, actually, I want it to be federated identity provider because I seem to have SAML, Facebook, Amazon, Apple credentials that I can use. So I'm just going to use that. Now, in this pool, you can say whether you want to use username, email, or phone number. I'm just going to say email, can't change after the user has been created. Yep. So now I can go for the default. I don't really want to change that. You can require MFA. As security people, all of us would love to have an MFA, but most of the time, if you choose, you can have an optional MFA where you can allow for the user to basically go down the path of using MFA or not based on what your application desires. Or you can just completely have no MFA at all. But that's I would leave that to you and your organization to decide. But I'll go for the optional MFA, and I'll just say you can use Authenticator app because I don't want to pay money for the SMS part. Cool. All right, email only, and that sounds good. Cool. All right. So once you sign up, you probably want them to receive some kind of an email or SMS. They can self-register. That means on the login console, they would be able to do a self-registration as you go through it. I'm using email address as a way to authenticate. That's my traditional username password analogy. Email address would be my username. And I don't want to add any more additional attributes, but you can choose to add as many attributes as you like, which you think your application would require. Now, I do want to call out when I say application in Amazon Cognito, when people talk about Amazon Cognito, they're usually either talking about a web application, like a website, like facebook.com, instagram.com, or whatever, or most likely they're talking about API or application programmable interface. If you don't know what these things are, I would definitely encourage you to Google them. Another thing to call out, and I don't think you realize it, but every time I do a click over here, like if I click on next or previous or just key back on next, or click on any other service over here, essentially what we are doing every time Amazon console is making an API call to an API gateway in the background every time we click on any buttons on the console, which is why for most of the options that you see on the console, there is an exposed AWS CLI command that you can use, or even an Amazon API command that you can use to do the exact same thing using automation. So something to be wary of. I am okay with the default, so I'm just going to ignore the email. Oh, I want from email, no option. All right. And I'm just, instead of setting up an Amazon SES service, which is recommended, which is the Amazon simple email service, there's a charge for it as well. So, I mean, there's a charge for using Cognito beyond a certain point as well, but keep it really simple. I'm just going to use the send email with Cognito option. That's my verification email, and I'll go next. Your user pool, I'm just going to call it, because I'm a Harry Potter fan, I'm just going to go in and type in my team name. Yes, I am a Gryffindor fan for all you haters out there. That's pretty much it. I'm going to use the hosted UI that is available by Cognito. And you can also choose to have a custom domain. I'm just going to call it the same thing, gryffindor.auth.ul, blah, blah. I would want a client, which is, I'm just going to say Harry Potter is my client name. I don't want to generate a client secret, and I'll give a reason for this before. I'm just going to say it's my local host. Is that a callback? Yeah, it's callback URL. Basically, so local host port 8000 or port 80, callback URL. That's it. Now, obviously, you would have this information from the application that your client that you're trying to create, which is, in my case, is Harry Potter, but you could just have, I don't know, something really important over there. And that could be the way to go about this. This would be the URL that I would be passing along as a username password URL. So I'm going to go next. And once this goes through, I know, sorry. Should work. You wait for the available symbol because I just realized include lowercase alphanumeric and hyphens only. So definitely use a small g for your Gryffindor or whatever your favorite Harry Potter team is. Sweet. So now we have set this up. We have self-registration, Cognito, all the default attributes. Now I'm going to create a user pool. Now, at this point in time, I have my user pool created, and I'm able to use that as a way to link this to my application, which is my Harry Potter Gryffindor application, and I would be able to use that in. Now, federated identity is where you would have your identity pool. Like, remember that I mentioned the other kind of identity pool, so I'm just going to call it Gryffindor AWS calls. So you basically I'm not going to enable unauthenticated basic flow authentication. All right, now we're just basically saying, hey, which one do you want to use? You have something here if you need to incognito. You can use Amazon if you want Apple ID. SAML, or even you want a custom one that you may have your custom backend, you can basically use that as a way to create your identity pools. So you can start having your app make calls to AWS services using temporary credentials. So that's what identity pool and user pools are like. You can definitely, once you're done with this, and if you don't need the user pool anymore, definitely delete that. So I'm just going to go Cognito. All right, so now we're back onto the main console and we have created one user pool already. Something to note, if you notice, I'm in North Virginia at the moment, and this is where my AWS Cognito is. But if I were to go to London, my hometown, you would notice that there is no pool over here, which to you should indicate that, hey, my user identity and user directory is only in North Virginia, nowhere else. This is going to be important when we talk about security best practices. That's pretty much what I wanted to show for the demo walkthrough. Let's go back into the video. Okay, so now you have some idea about what Amazon Cognito can provide in terms of different user identity and how you would use it, why the region is important. Now, you may also wonder, why would an application even bother using Amazon Cognito? It's worthwhile calling out that it is a user directory for customers, primarily your consumer customers. I took this image from the Amazon console website. You probably would realize that your Amazon Cognito is literally just an username authentication, which can attach to anything as an application, but it can also help you extend your application to Amazon services like API Gateway, S3, DynamoDB, and other services that are supported. You may also look at this as a way to have an extended user base, which is not just your own user base in your on-premise, which is basically your staff and employee, but this is more for the customers of the application that you're trying to create. And you would not want them to be in your own directory, in your own premise. You probably want them stored somewhere in Amazon or another location, or maybe even closer to the application itself. So you're able to make sure that, hey, I just want to be able to access the users quickly enough. And they should also understand that the application should have context of AWS services that can be used to perform various actions like requesting temporary credentials or accessing services in DynamoDB, because you are trying to save your users into DynamoDB as well for whatever other reason you want. That's why a lot of people use Cognito, because it's easy. And another few terms that you probably want to know before we get into security best practice is something called user lifecycle management. Now, we did a whole video series on the identity and access management. It's a few shorts on our YouTube channel. Definitely check that out on the Cloud Security Podcast YouTube channel. But for the context of this video, I would probably say you definitely need to understand what a user lifecycle management is. User lifecycle management is people like you and I, or identities in general in cloud. When we log in or when we are joining a company, someone in the company is going to create a profile, which is the diagram over here on the left. Someone creates an IT profile for us, which we can get some basic rights to log in into a laptop, log in into intranet, log in into a few things. As you kind of continue onboarding, you probably will get access to HR because you want to get your money for all the hard work you're doing in the company. As you progress in your career, in your organization, you might start getting additional apps which you might have to work with. Like, for example, as a CISO, I had access to user management based, not in the context of managing user access, but also in the context of, if I have people who are in my team, I want to be able to manage their profile so that I know what their progress is for the learning path. If they're trying to go for a cloud security bootcamp like the one that we run, what stage are they at? How quickly can they finish it? What would they learn from it? Is the money worth it? Is it free? Blah, 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 blah. Any other requirement that you would have as you kind of keep building your profile in your organization. Tomorrow you become a manager, and maybe even after that you become a CEO of a company. As you kind of grow your portfolio of experience in your organization, you may have access to more or less applications based on how you kind of keep going. And that's where the changes part comes in. You're basically changing roles, that comes with changing applications that you get access to. Now, finally, after working there for a long time, you decide, actually, I think I've had enough of this. So I'm going to just leave and depart. Now, obviously, the flow makes you feel that changes happen much earlier, but they almost also happen after you have been onboarded and been there for a while. So technically, the onboard should have been here and the changes should have been here. But hey, this is the diagram from the internet. So don't blame me, blame the internet. At this point in time, you have decided that, okay, I've had a lot of career experience in this organization. It's time for me to spread my wings and move on to another company. And as you depart, that's also known as offboarding. There will be some processes involved for them to remove you from every application you have had access to. Now, I would also simplify this further. If you look on the right, now, after spending almost 4+ years on identity and access management alone, yes, I had a career where I was only doing identity and access management. These are some of the words you would use quite often. You are a new employee to an organization. You are provisioned into the directory. In our case, it's a Cognito, but it could be Amazon, Azure directory, Azure AD, it could be Amazon directory, it could be any other user directory that you hold and maintain. After that, you would have a certain set of applications that are enforced by policy. Like you would not get to access to all the applications that the company has access to. Based on your role, you might be given access to certain enforced policies. Based on your changing role and as you grow, as I mentioned before, you expand your portfolio, then you also start updating those policies as well and get access to more services. Towards the end, someone somewhere is also managing these access, and that's hence the reason for Circle completely coming over here. As part of maintaining a user base, a lot of companies are required by compliance and industry standards to regularly review the user access to make sure that, hey, is Ashish still a CISO, or has he left and become a CISO of, I don't know, some of the company, or has he become a complete YouTuber like Ashish over here? Has he been offboarded correctly? If he has not been offboarded, what's the gap in the process and how we should be offboarded? That's what user lifecycle management is. This is definitely important because Cognito is all about username, password, user credentials, authentication, authorization. That's basically your world as you deep dive into Cognito. Another term you probably want to come across quite often is token lifecycle management. Now, tokens can be described similar to cookies, but they're not really cookies. If you authenticate yourself using a industry standard like OpenID Connect or OAuth, you get a token which is primarily used by API services or modern web applications these time. They use access token, which is a token which is short-lived, gives you access to information that, hey, Ashish authenticated. So app developer, you can verify that Ashish is authenticated and he or she has consented to the use of their information by another application. I'm going to use the example what I called out earlier in the video about me able to post my LinkedIn post onto Twitter just by giving Twitter access to my LinkedIn profile. That's where I would have been issued an access token and potentially also something called an ID token as well, which is the information about Ashish as a user. And this is important because, for example, every time a user authenticates in the context of Cognito to an API or to a web application, because you are given a token, that token becomes quite important because I can use that token in any other way in the same application and it would assume that it's Ashish, not anyone else who's malicious. So you should be able to revoke those tokens. You should be able to issue new tokens if they are expired. And if you are able to assign tokens as well. So if you kind of follow the picture over here, you create tokens, you assign them to Ashish, you've activated it. Oh, then you realize Ashish is performing suspicious behavior. So I'm going to suspend his account or maybe even remove the token on completely. And maybe I was incorrect and I don't have to remove it. So I might expire the token after a certain amount of time because that's what my app requires. This is token lifecycle management, definitely something important for you to understand if you're working in the world of a single page app or an API or any modern application that is out there. And definitely Google this more if you need more information about it, but especially in the identity and access management space. This is something you should be aware of as you build an architecture for how would someone authenticate or authorize to an application. As a cloud security architect or a cloud security engineer, this is going to be really important for you. We're finally to the crux of the video, which is Amazon Cognito Services. Amazon Cognito Service is comprised of two forms of users. One is the Amazon side, which is people like you and I who may have access to the Amazon console themselves. And we can obviously use Cognito the same way I did in the demo walkthrough just before. I can use that to delete a user pool. I can use that to create a user pool. I can use that to create client or maybe even add a client. Now, the other side that you also need to worry about is the client application side, which is the client that is interacting with Amazon Cognito to authorize user to access information. This is where your split comes in. I'm going to talk about the AWS service as a security best practice first, and then we're going to talk about the application side as well. Once you have the access token for Cognito, you can use the identity pool to get access to these AWS services, as I had shown earlier. But what you can also do is through the back channels, you would be able to monitor which of these services should have access. Like, for example, if you only want API gateway access, you probably want to limit the role or the user base of that access token to be limited just to that. You don't want Ashish who can log into a console to be able to go to API gateway. You don't want additional AWS services to be given access to AWS Cognito. So if you are choosing to go for the API gateway, you probably also want to look out for any others like a Lambda function or something similar, which may be extending the user pool to another service like a DynamoDB or any other AWS service. So definitely be mindful of what AWS services are allowed to have access to the user pool, because let's just be honest, user pool is probably really sensitive, especially if it's your customer data. Another thing you could do is use AWS WAF or Web Application Firewall, which has features like you can use rate limiting. So basically, that is the number of requests that someone can send in a particular minute. You can limit that to say, hey, I only want 10 requests to come per second. Anything more than that, I would think someone is trying to attack me. So you can use rate limiting. You can use something called allow or deny list. You could say, hey, folks from, I don't know, this particular region in the world. I don't want to name any country, so I'm just going to go in the middle of the ocean somewhere. Somewhere in the middle of an ocean, if someone decides to log into my WAF, if I am able to pinpoint their location, I want to deny them access. And I can deny the entire region altogether if you want to. Another thing you also want to have is web ACLs that are available from the AWS WAF marketplace. You can use those as well to secure your API or web application that you're trying to protect with a WAF. Now, a great example for this is the Gryffindor user pool that I created. I can come in here, I can go to user pool properties, and I can say, hey, I want to have AWS WAF in there. Now, you also want to make sure that Amazon Cognito is in a compliance standard for this business requirement you may have. Now, based on documentation, Amazon Cognito is compliant with a lot of popular industry standards, but if you have a special industry standard because you work in a special sector, like for example, energy sector has their own standards, medical industry may have their own standards, so that every other industry out there which may have their own standards that they may have developed, you definitely need to be wary if your Amazon Cognito is compliant to their service or not before you use it. Another one to call out over here is you should only use it in a region that you're legally allowed to for holding data. Now, the example for this, as I called out earlier, is that I was creating user pool in the North Virginia region, but that's where my requirement is. But if I were to have users in London region, which also happens to have something called a GDPR, which I should be very careful for not moving data from here, the London region, to the North Virginia region. So you need to be aware which region should the user directory exist in, and whether that's legally allowed for your consumers to have your data there. Like, for example, being in Australia, I would not want my Australian citizens' data to be leaving the Australian region, or the UK citizens' data to be leaving the UK region of London. So something to be mindful of as you go through this. Another thing you can also do is you can use organization SCPs to manage user pool deletion, creation, or maybe even locking your region. But what you can also do is if you go back into the user pool, you can come onto the user pool properties. Nowadays, they have deletion protection feature. Clearly, it was happening so often that they had to add this as a service, similar to S3 Bucket. You don't want to deactivate it. What this would do is it would prevent accidental deletion of your user pool if you have a possibility of someone deleting it. Last but not least is talking about AWS CloudTrail. Make sure it is enabled in your account because you want to be able to monitor for things which you feel are otherwise very suspicious. Like, for example, why would you want to create a new user pool or even delete an existing user pool by deactivating that? That's a suspicious behavior. Or you may even add users to have more permission for Amazon Cognito. That's also suspicious. All of that suspicious behavior can be collected and monitored and alerted on by CloudTrail. You can also use something like a combination of EventBridge and CloudWatch to go down that path as well. But these are some of the best practices that you should be aware of as you work on the Amazon Cognito in the AWS side. Now, again, this is just the Amazon side. It is a managed service. So another thing that you might want to worry about is our encryption. Because this is a service managed by Amazon, they would take care of the encryption at rest because they are the ones who are storing the data. You're not. And by default, as per the documentation, they encrypt the data that is stored in Amazon Cognito. But transit is on you, which brings me to the application. Encryption in transit over here is responsibility of the user. They want to make sure that the request that they're making should be to a SSL or HTTPS link, not to a HTTP or non-encrypted link. Another thing you could be doing for the application that you create is using industry standards for authentication and authorization. For example, we spoke about OpenID Connect OAuth 2.0, SAML, and a lot more, just not the standard username password. These days, there are a lot more industry standards that are available for you to have an understanding that, yes, I have done the right thing by the customers. I am using an industry standard. So this industry standard protects me from making a mistake in my own custom username password that I might have created. Because trust me, people believe that I can secure the username password to the best way possible. And this is where something called a pen testing is required for the application. And what you find is a lot of times the username password or the login page itself is quite weak. And because they are not using an industry standard, they tend to just go, belly up first on the login on security test when it's performed on the login page. I also already mentioned user lifecycle management. Hopefully you remember what it is. You would have to do that for your app as well as for your AWS users, whether it's a change of role or you're revoking a role for users that are registering into your application. Like, for example, if I had a user registered onto my user profile over here, in my user pool, if I go to Gryffindor, they would appear over here. I can create a user and add them over here, send invitation and all that. But essentially, this user pool over here. I can delete and create user as well. So something to be wary of as you kind of go down that path, that you need to manage the life cycle of them as well and be able to give them the right access when they need it. Another one is the token lifecycle management, which I called out earlier, which is managing the tokens that are being issued, having the ability to revoke them if you don't need to, and definitely deciding where to store them, whether you store them on the browser of the client or whether you store them on the server side. That would depend on the threat model or the attack vectors that you're thinking that may be applicable in your case. Like, a lot of people may have a mobile application, and it's very common for a lot of people to think that they should pin their SSL certificate onto that with a really long expiry date, which is probably a bad idea because when you have to update it, you can't push an update and it becomes more complicated. So whatever choice you make for the application, make sure you make the right choice based on the threat matrix or the threat modeling exercise you had performed. And also something from a access token hygiene perspective, just the tokens in general. Like, for example, if you use OpenID Connect, it would give you something called JOT, which is JSON Web Token. And I just realized I just called JOT token, which is kind of like saying ATM machine. So I should not use the JOT token best practice. But if you have a JOT, which is a JSON Web Token, one of the best practice you could do over there is not to have any sensitive information on it. Keep it limited to the scope of what you're trying to cover for, which brings me to the access token. Access token should also be only limited to things that you are allowing it should be able to access to. Like, for example, you want to make sure that you're able to verify the token before a decision is made. You want to have access token to have short lifetime. They're not active for a long time. Now, these are some of the best practices you might have to apply for your application, but you can obviously excel and do a lot more. You can just go down the path of doing DevSecOps, deploying the application using the right security practices for application security. But that is all outside the scope of this particular video. But if you want me to make a video on the whole DevSecOps in cloud, I gave a talk about this at one of the Sneak events recently, which I can leave a link for as well over here. If you want to know how to do DevSecOps in cloud, definitely leave a comment and maybe I can just cover that video over here as well on this YouTube channel. But definitely subscribe if you want to be able to know more about cloud security. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Hopefully you understand the best practices required from a security perspective for Amazon Cognito. Now you're ready to enable authentication authorization capability in your application. Now, if you're wondering, hey, that's auth N, auth Z, that's basically how the cool people call out authentication is auth N. Authorization is auth Z. Now, if you enjoyed this video or if you have any questions about cloud security, definitely drop them as a comment and we'll try our best to make a video on the topic that is top of mind for you in the cloud security space. If you have any questions or probably want to learn more about cloud security, definitely check out the rest of the YouTube channel. Subscribe and hit the bell icon if you are someone who just wants to be notified every time we release a new cloud security video, where we do interviews with a lot of cloud security experts so that you don't have to learn by paying money, but at least you can learn from professionals who've already done the hard part for you. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover for this video. I will see you all in the next class next week. Take care.